And at this time, I would like to introduce Matthew Epinette, who is the director of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, now at LeTourneau University. Matthew has been a good friend of the society and is the sponsor of this session. So thank you, Matthew, for your partnership and for your friendship with the society. And go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Benjamin. Very grateful to be a part of this and to be able to sponsor this first session. As Benjamin mentioned, the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity is now located at LeTourneau University. We were at Trinity International University and Trinity Evangelical Divinity School up in the northern Chicago suburbs since our founding back in 1994. And some of you are aware of what all has gone on there. They have closed the undergraduate and graduate school, and the divinity school is moving to merge with Trinity Western University in far Western Canada. And so we went through a process over 2025 of exploring options for a new home, and we have landed here at LeTourneau. We're located in East Texas, about 2 hours east of Dallas, about 3 hours north of Houston, about 1 hour west of the Louisiana state line, right along Interstate 20 to kind of triangulate our new location. And as you can see from the graphic behind me, LeTourneau bills itself as the Christian Polytechnic University, and the term polytechnic meaning basically the many arts, but carries this connotation of drawing from the theoretical, from the liberal arts, and then from the technical fields and applying all of that to technical questions and technical issues. So the largest major here at LeTourneau is engineering, and the second largest is aviation. We also have a nursing school, and it's ranked number 5 in the state of Texas. So excellent work going on in the healthcare field here at LeTourneau, and so we're very glad to be here. The center, as I mentioned, founded in 1994. We target or we aim at sort of 3 areas: the academic arena, primarily. And so we have our own conference coming up at the end of June. And it will be here on the LeTourneau campus in East Texas and available online. So you can participate from wherever you are without necessarily having to travel to East Texas, but we would love to welcome you here on campus. Our second area is the next generation of bioethicists. And so we have a master's degree program, and we are closing it down at Trinity this semester. And we will be launching a new master's degree program and bioethics undergraduate minor certificate programs here at LeTourneau in the spring of 27, so 1 year from now. And then finally, we try and address church leaders, pastors, laypersons who lead in their churches on these bioethics issues, and what a Christian perspective, how that helps to inform our decision making and the actions that we take. So you can visit our website at cbhd.org. We also run the website bioethics.com. And you can sign up at bioethics.com for a daily news update that we just aggregate bioethics news stories from around the internet, trying to keep abreast of the wide range of issues that we're all aware of in bioethics. So thanks again for the opportunity to be a sponsor. And I just add my welcome and the welcome of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity to what's already been shared. The speaker for the first session is Adam Omelianchuk, and he is a fellow at the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. So I've known Adam for a few years now. His full bio and range of research is listed there on page 5, and so I would commend that to your reading. But just briefly, he is an assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine and a practicing clinical ethicist at Houston Methodist Hospital in Houston. He researches a variety of areas. He'll be speaking to us today on xenotransplantation, but he also looks at the dead donor rule, double effect, and normothermic regional perfusion, among other things. As I say, I've known Adam for several years now, and I know him to be a very careful and very deep thinker. And so any topic that he addresses, he knows well. It's much, much more than just a surface acquaintance with it. He dives very deep into it and thinks very carefully about it. So I'm very much looking forward to his talk, The Promises of the Pig. What should we expect from xenotransplantation? So Adam, I turn it over to you with our welcome. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Matt. That was really kind of you to say. Just get this screen sharing up here. All right. So I'm very honored to be talking to you all about this topic, xenotransplantation and the promises of the pig. I really have like a couple goals here in the talk, is to get into like the question, what should we expect from xenotransplantation? But also to kind of set the stage for all the different topics in this conference, which are very near and dear to my heart: death determination, uh, moral status of the donor, living transplantation issues, normothermic regional perfusion, double effect. So I will touch on a lot of those things to help motivate, right, this question: what should we expect from Xeno? So just some disclosures here. The presentation that I've made here was made with a lot of content derived from this book that my colleagues Chris Bobier and Dan Hurst and I published last summer. If you're interested in this topic, of course, I recommend our own book. You should probably look to your academic library to find it because it's an academic book and it's by Routledge. It's pricey. So another thing I need to say too is that my views here that I express do not necessarily represent the views of the institutions I'm affiliated with, the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, Baylor College of Medicine, and Houston Methodist Hospital. All right, so whenever you get into any kind of conversation about xenotransplantation or organ donation, you have to start with the organ shortage stats. It's just a kind of ritual, all right? And so this is what sets up the topic, the moral imperative for doing all this kind of stuff, right? And as of November of 2024, the total number of people waitlisted in the US, and I'm sorry for those of you who are from Europe or Asia. This is going to be just a US-centered kind of way of thinking. I will try to keep in mind that there's other things going on in other places, but my data comes from the US. You'll see that here in the US, at least of 2024, there was about 114,000 people waitlisted for organ transplantation. So these are people who've gone through an intensive medical workup, psychosocial workup, financial workup, and they've been put on a list saying, you can get an organ, right? So that's already a lot of resources invested into these types of patients. And you'll see that most of them are kidney recipients or potential recipients. They need kidneys. People are on dialysis, and the kidney is the way to get off dialysis. You'll see the next there is liver, about 9,500, and then hearts coming in third, about 3,500, and so on. So that's a lot of people on the wait list. Now you can look here at the total number of transplants. This comes from 2023, and the total number is about 46,000. Okay, so that's quite a difference, right? We're not even close to meeting the people who need organs, or like maybe a third of the way there. And so about 2023, 17 people that were waitlisted would die on the wait list per day. That's down now to about 13. I checked the other day, and there might be some reasons for that we can get into. So that might be some good news or some bad news, depending on how you view the ways in which how things are working out in the U.S. Are working to get more donors. If you look at the mortality-based removals on the wait list, it hovers around 7,000 to 7,500 a year. Except now, right, we've gotten a little bit below 6,000. This is like the first time since 1998 where that number has trended down. Again, there's probably some reasons for this that we can get into about why things are expanding in the donation space. If you look at the donor types, the types of donors that are recovered, this is available from the Procurement Transplant Network in the US. You'll see in 2025, right? There were 16,500 or so deceased organ donors. Living donation was about 7,000. All right. And the total number of organs recovered was about 3 to 4 per deceased donor, so 57,000. And you'll see here that you have some statistics kind of going upwards since 2015 of the brain death pathway donor. And you really see an increase in the donation of circulatory determination of death, and that's continuing to rise. So this is a little bit old. There's almost a hockey stick type of graph here, right? And we'll get into why. Okay, so you see that you get a lot of organs out of the deceased donor pathway, 3 to 4, and just like 1 to 1 with living. Living is really great for kidney donation, especially, but that has kind of plateaued really since the year 2000. 2020, you see a dip because of COVID, but it's back up. So here's the thing, right, about what's really going on here is that no one's really happy with the status quo. Okay, nobody. And so there's this big question, right, that once we present these organ stats, right, and we show the shortage, we say this is no good, we have to increase the organ yield, right? There's a kind of moral imperative to do this, all right? And so there's different policies that have been suggested, all right? So one of the ones that's been really interesting and debated since kind of 2008 is this idea of changing the default on consent. All right, so in the US, we have a opt-in system where you have to gift and sort of make some kind of declaration or authorization that you're an organ donor. There has to be some kind of burden of proof that's met where you say, I'm an organ donor. Okay, in places like Spain, and I think now in the UK, and then I think back in the past, Chile, they did something different, right? They presumed consent, right? And then you had to provide evidence that you didn't want to be a donor. Okay, so that's a kind of shift of the way the default works. The thought was that there'll be more people that are just like automatically registered for donors. And the evidence on this policy is mixed. In Spain, it did really bring the donation rates up. In Chile, it did not. And the UK's experience is still emerging. There's another type of thing that has been suggested in the donation after circulatory determination of death pathway. Right now in the US, at least, that only happens under a controlled circumstance. So what does that mean? Well, this is a patient who's in the ICU, has a bad brain injury, but it's not brain dead. The rest of their organs are in pretty good shape, so these are not people in multi-system organ failure. And then like the surrogate decision makers or the family, whoever it is, it's authorized to make decisions, will then make a decision to withdraw life-sustaining treatment. Then like the organ procurement people approach, they work up a donation, and then you're terminally extubated and you go to the OR, and then procurement happens after a death determination. In the uncontrolled variety, that is different, right? This can happen outside the hospital. It can happen inside the hospital. Somebody codes, and there's a resuscitation process that ensues. And then there's a decision that's this, well, this is futile. This is not working anymore. And then there's a kind of treatment transition to then keep you alive for organ support purposes. And then you become a donor through the circulatory death pathway. And that is tried in Europe in different places. Some bioethicists think there could be a 20% increase of organs given in that way. But the big problem that the US has had with this is very hard to determine consent of a donor in extremis, in these emergency circumstances. More time to determine that authorization process has seen to be a barrier to this policy to really figure that out. Okay. Another proposal is to mandate normothermic regional perfusion, or NRP, in all donation after circulatory determination death protocols. So what is normothermic regional perfusion? That's a whole entire talk that I can't give right now, but I have this little surgical picture here that kind of describes what's going to go on. The idea is that after the donor progresses to a systole, right, and then they wait 5 minutes to rule out auto resuscitation, they open the chest, okay, and then they cannulate with like an ECMO or bypass machine, the right atrium and the ascending aorta, and then they clamp the vessels to the brain, or occlude them or cut them or however they do it. And then what they do is they get that ECMO machine going again, and that heart then is to be resuscitated or revived, start beating again. And then they build a circuit around the organs they want. So in this case, it would be the chest organs and the abdominal ones. There's different versions of just targeting the abdominal ones too. It gets complicated, all right? But the idea is that you can kind of create a mimic of the brain dead donor, right? Now, what's nice about the brain dead donor is that their hearts are still beating, all right? So we can declare them dead, but their hearts are still beating and they're bathing those organs in oxygenated blood, and those organs are just have better outcomes for graft function and uptake and so on and so forth. And this is what the transplant surgeons really want to do in the US. They've been doing it more in Europe, right? In other places, it's not legal in Australia. There's been a pause in the UK. There's all kinds of debate about this, right? But that is one solution that people are talking about. The other one is to expand machine perfusion ideas and technologies. So here, like you might take the heart out of the donor who's been declared dead on circulatory grounds. You put it on a machine outside the body, right? So that's like the big difference between machine perfusion and normothermic regional perfusion, is that there's an inside-outside distinction. Okay, so those are some things that are really being debated here in the US and being worked out. More controversially, just change the definition of death, right? Donor organs are too rare. This was a headline in the New York Times. And so because they're rare, we just need a new definition of death, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to include people who are in comas but can breathe, or maybe even those who can open their eyes, right, and look around, but have like some sort of diagnosis of vegetative state, right? Those people we need to include as well. Or anybody who's maybe just like made a decision to withdraw life support, that has also been like thought of as a way of like, hey, that's death too. And that is very controversial. As you can imagine, it's totally driven by organ interests. And so people have worries about that. For living donation, there's proposals to have remuneration, right, for people who are giving kidneys. So giving a kidney is expensive, right? And not just in terms of like cost, which can be covered, right? But also your time, all right, off of work. You have to go through a lot of different appointments, a big surgery, and then you have to recover, okay? And so there's a lot of like lost time that happens there. And so there's this idea that, hey, if you can kind of compensate for those things, right? We could get rid of that plateau that we see in living donation. All right. And so this book, Kidney to Share, gets into that. It's not a market. We're not selling the organ for the highest bidder, but rather it's a way of compensating those who take up the charity of living donation. Others think we could just reject the dead donor rule. This is a constraint, right? This actually is what defines deceased organ donation. All right. Once you get rid of the dead donor rule, you get rid of deceased organ donation. Okay. And then it just becomes kind of like end-of-life donation or something like that. You could allow organ donation euthanasia. Other proposals that are much more radical are about organ conscription. So here you might think of like, we're going to make you a donor, just like we make people serve in the military. All right. And so that is just like, you don't even get a say, right? Society just decides that you're a donor. I don't think that policy has been tried anywhere, but that's the kind of stuff we talk about in the philosophical seminar room. Right, so that's a lot of different options. I went over those quickly. All right, we can talk about any one of those in the Q&A. I would welcome that. But let's talk about what the status quo at least aspires to, and especially here in the US. All right, this is something that I paid a lot of attention to in my own research. And the President's Council of Bioethics that was functional from 2000, 2008 under George W. Bush was really interested in putting out literature on this topic. They never got around to it and finished it. There was two parts to it. The first part was to address the controversies over the determination of death and say, well, first of all, can there even be such a thing as deceased organ donation? Can you define death in such a way that it will allow for it? And they had kind of a mixed response in their deliberations, but they did come out in favor of a model of the idea of death being consistent with the brain criteria we use and the circulatory determination of death criteria that we use. And I'll just disclose this is the view that I land on. I like their model and I've defended it in print. So that's kind of where I'm at, just to disclose that. But one of the things that they really care about and what they want to do is they want to uphold the gift model of donation. They think that this will promote solidarity, friendship, and health to save lives that are based on a generosity-based policy, right? Not the corrupting forces of markets that just reward the highest payer. Okay, they conceive of donation as a personal decision requiring an affirmative voluntary choice, something that can't be presumed or implied, all right? So the presumptive type of policy is out with them. They really want to ensure that there's respect for the dying, okay? And especially in the donation after circulatory death pathway. You have patients here who are very close to death, right? But, you know, the organ people come in here and they want to do their workup. They want to infringe upon the family's time with the dying, infringe upon that comfort care phase. And that gets contentious, right? And as somebody who works in the hospital and kind of deals with this on a daily basis, this is a real sensitive area, okay? So they want to be able to have respect for that phase. And they want to uphold the rule for deceased organ donors that transplant surgery ought to only begin once the donor is soundly declared dead. Okay, so rejecting the dead donor rule is not an option for them. All right, and so they also want to uphold fair application of principles that distribute organs equitably and on the basis of clinical utility, not social privilege, who has the most money, or what your social status is. I mean, even a prisoner, right, could get a kidney on the basis of clinical criteria. Just because you're in prison doesn't mean that punishment entails no access, right, to organs. All right, so this is part of what they wanted to do. Unfortunately, they never were able to publish this book, but it is on the archives of the Georgetown website if you're ever interested in reading about it. Okay, so how have Christians responded to all these kind of problems like this? Like, okay, we need to maximize donor yield, right? That is like the biggest question here. How do we respond to that? Right? And I count at least four. I think there's like three that usually get counted in the literature. I'm going to count four to just kind of set up my talk here, right? But the first way is to sort of like uphold the current criteria that we use for determining death. All right, and then we kind of scrutinize alternatives, right? Things like NRP, Christians tend to be more critical of, although that's not universal. And then things like Xeno, which we'll talk about. The other option here is to reject the current death criteria and ban deceased organ donation, or at least counsel people to get off the registry and then look into like preventative medicine, help people expand living donation, and maybe look to some technology like total artificial hearts or xenotransplantation. The third option is to, well, maybe not reject current death criteria, but you can at least be critical of it and bypass it. But what you really need to reject is the dead donor rule, and then do what we do in deceased organ donation under the framework of living donation and appeal to the doctrine of double effect to carry out the operation. Okay, so that's another one. And then the fourth is just to express pessimism about everything and then just focus on developing alternatives. Xeno, lab-grown organs, mechanical organs, and so on. All right, so I want to go over these in detail, right? Just to kind of, because this is going to be part of our conference, so why not talk about them, all right? So and I'll talk about the pros and cons, okay? So upholding the current death criteria, right? And so there's a big fight that's happening over this, the fight for what's called the Goldilocks zone, right? My friend Chris DeCock talks about this in a recent paper. We don't want to go too far in expanding death criteria to include people who are like breathing. That's too hot, and we don't want to go too far about restricting it, right? So that we can't really do any kind of organ donation at all. And so we're going to have this. That's too cold. So we have to get it just right, right? So I've been involved in this debate. Right, I've advocated for this view called the neurorespiratory criteria view. This is a view that aligns with what the clinical exam that is defined by standard of care in the American Academy of Neurology. This is what it zeroes in on, right? It tests for the lack of capacity for consciousness, the lack of the capacity for spontaneous breathing, and the lack of brainstem reflexes. That's what the exam can do, and that's about all it can do. All right, and and so there you go. That's what, and I think there's a biological model, a concept of death that aligns with that. Brother Beckett Gremmels here is going to talk about this. There's a really nice new article in the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly Journal that gets into this. I highly commend that to you. But I got in all kinds of trouble with my colleagues from the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, especially Dan Macy and Alan Roberts, who just said, Adam, you're just all mixed up on this. You got to stick to the whole brain criteria, right? There's this part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is sensitive to salt and water balance issues in the blood. It sends a little signal to the pituitary gland that then releases antidiuretic hormone, and that makes all the difference. And you can't declare death without knowing that that's gone. So there's a really great paper that they published. I have the title of it there, Biophilosophical Approach to Determination of Death. It's really good. You should check it out. And then, right, so there's this question about defining death and making allowances for organ donation, all right? And so the pro to this, right, is to help waitlisted people, right? But the burden, of course, is taking on this burden of proof. That's really difficult to scrutinize, saying things no to things like NRP, right? Really criticizing and looking into the incentives for living donation or Xeno, right? There's a lot of work here to be done, and it's hard, all right? And the burden of proof is high because the brain death skeptics and the determination of death by circulatory death skeptics, they got a blowtorch that they take to all this stuff, right? And they Alan Schumann, right? So anybody who is in this space is going to know his name and the very interesting work he started doing in the early 90s, tracking patients who were determined brain dead, but for whatever reason were not taking off the ventilator afterwards, and looking at the very interesting somatic functions that they still continue to display. His work has been summarized in a very fat book by Doyen Nguyen, The New Definitions of Death for Organ Donation. And then, of course, our colleague, Sister Heidi Klessig, has also summarized some of this stuff too. The case of Jahai McMath features prominently in these discussions. Anybody who's in this space should be haunted by this case, should be their conscience should be pricked. They should look deeply into what's going on and what's happening here. All right. For these people, there's just no conceptual justification whatsoever for our current death criteria. There's no reliable way to determine death for organ donation. And so to be pro-life is to be opposed to deceased organ donation. It's just not, it's a farce, it's murderous. You should take yourself off the registry. That tends to be the kind of messaging we get. Schumann himself is a little more open to a socially constructed view of death based on circulatory to death criteria. I don't know what his views on that are now today, but there is some papers that he wrote saying he was in principle okay with that. At any rate, at the end of the day, the real, I think, advantage of this view is that it provides a lot of motivation for protecting vulnerable ICU patients, okay? There's a lot of sloppiness in the death determination space. We are seeing this in news stories. We're seeing this in case reports. It's really tragic. And so one of the things I really like about these people and their activism is that they're holding the people like the American Academy of Neurology's feet to the fire saying, you got to do this right. If you're going to do anything at all, you got to do it right. Now, they don't think they should be doing it all, but hey, they're holding people accountable and they're protecting the dignity and upholding the sanctity of life for donors who are in a very, very, very vulnerable space. So I think I commend this and I praise this. But here's the one drawback, right? Which everybody starts asking questions about, well, wait, if we do that, then what about all these people on the wait list? And I think the consequence here is that they just end up getting abandoned to increased morbidity and mortality. Now, that might just be a consequence of the view. When I was working out my own views on this, I was prepared to take this position. But I had to count it as a cost. And I think that anybody who takes up this position has to be able to think about this. And the relationships that we form with people on the wait list, and I've worked with some of them, it's tragic to see them get onto a bridge to nowhere or not end up with an organ and they end up dying. So this does, I think it is a cost, and it has to be something we have to reckon with. And for people who are really sensitive to that, well, maybe you can intend your way out. All right, maybe you can use a theory of intention to bypass, right, the charge of homicide, okay, and the moral wrong of taking life. All right, so here, these kind of people are maybe a little more indifferent to death criteria. They tend to reject the current death criteria, but they also reject the dead donor rule, right? If they say, okay, you can start the operation on them when they're living. Give them some anesthesia, of course, right? But you can do what we do under deceased organ donation under a living donation framework. So there's got to be informed consent, not just like first person authorization, but you could appeal to double effect, right, in order to avoid the wrong of homicide. All right. So here the idea is that death that results from surgery is just a foreseen side effect, right? It's not something that's intended when removing vital organs. And really interestingly, this does allow for NRP, right? My dissertation supervisor, Chris Tollefson, recently just wrote an article about this, and he defends all this, right? It's very interesting. And it's something that we went round and round on as we were working out my dissertation in grad school. So Charlie Kamasi, who's another speaker here, and his colleague Joseph Vukov, they defend this as well, double effect donation. All right, Brother Masick here, Lawrence Masick, has written a recent article too about this. I see he's presenting. And so the pro here is that they can maintain aid for those on the wait listed, but the con is that they're really going to increase surgeon liability, right? The surgeon's going to have to take on all this responsibility for carrying out the right sort of intentions and actions and avoiding like the problem of closeness and problem of relevant description and all these things that come up in the action theory literature. And I'll tell you just one thing about surgeons that I've learned in the last few years of working with them is that they are very allergic to liability. They're at risk averse, believe it or not, when it comes to that, all right? They do not want to be held liable for really anything about taking the donor's life and so on and so forth. All right. So the other thing too is that if you were to solve that problem, would this end up being trustworthy for the public? This is just ripe for abuse. It's very easy to conflate what's happening here under this framework with euthanasia, right? And trying to help people donate and these types of things. It could very easily be corrupted. All right. And for good reasons, right? So we might want to avoid this policy just for that. All right, now option 4, right? This isn't maybe a real option, but I want to highlight our organizer here, Xavier Simons, and his response to a lot of this stuff. He wrote a response to Chris, and he was very critical of double effect donation. He's a skeptic of the current death criteria. He thinks the dead donor rule really matters. We should probably uphold it, and so that kind of compels him to look for alternatives, right? And so this is what's going to set up my talk. All right. He says that it may be the case that these debates will one day be irrelevant given the speed with which xenotransplantation techniques are developing. It may be sooner rather than later that our greater resource of organ transplants will not be human beings, but rather pigs who are specially bred to provide organ transplants. Okay, so the pro here is that you can kind of bypass all these different ethical debates, the death debate, the double effect debate, the dead donor rule debate, right? You can bypass all that, shift these moral burdens to animals, but then the con is like, well, could this really help, right? That's actually an open question. Do we know that this could work? And is it ethical? Right. And Xavier is aware of these ethical issues. I actually deleted those out, and the little ellipses there represent his view. So I'm just kind of picking on him for fun. But this is like the question that needs to be answered. All right. So that brings us, right. Finally, I just spent a half an hour kind of giving you the landscape. But hey, you gave me an hour to talk. So here we go. We're going to talk about xenotransplantation now and its perennial allure. And what is that? Well, that is bound up with shifting burdens, these moral hazards, and all these issues, right, of supplying organs. We're going to shift all that to animals. Okay, we're going to shift that to animals. It's no longer going to be kind of a human enterprise, right? And so this allows us to get away from redefining death criteria to create more organ donors. We don't have to do that. We don't have to encroach on the end of life care of people who have traumatic brain injuries and families who are wrestling with that agonizing decision to continue treatment. All right. There's no need to develop organ markets, okay, and have kidney exchanges and these types of things, at least for human organs. All right. And the other thing that's nice about this is that organs can be available in a relatively short period of time. Growing them inside of a pig can be optimized. They're the right sort of size. All right. And you can do some tissue type matching, genetic engineering to get the right sort of organ for the right sort of patient. All right. And we have enough kind of ICU support to carry somebody along on the wait list until this becomes available. You can have efficient coordination with the surgery team, right? You don't have to have somebody waking up in the middle of the night, getting on an airplane, flying out to rural Wyoming to get an organ from somebody who died in a skiing accident, and then transporting that back to I don't know Denver or wherever it is, and then waking everybody up trying to do the search. No, that none of that, all that disappears, right? You can do this all in the daytime. You can kind of figure things out, right? And that is why this has always been in the imagination of transplanters. So everybody actually in this debate is involved, is looking for the promise of Xeno. And that has been the case for a very long time. Just to kind of give you a really short history here. As far as back as we know, I think like the best evidence we have is that people are trying to use blood from sheep for transfusions. All right, for people who were bleeding out or things like this. Of course, it never worked. In the 1800s, they were using tendons and bones and skins and urethra from various animals to help patients. In the 1920s, rather weirdly, they were trying, I think in France, to take testicles out of a baboon, put them into men to increase virility and testosterone and all kinds of things. And it didn't work, thankfully. And then 1963, kidneys actually from baboons did see a little bit of success. One patient actually survived 9 months and was able to be discharged from the hospital. And then in 1964, right, the very first heart transplant that was actually attempted was in 1964 in Mississippi. There was a guy who was in his 60s who ended up he's in heart failure. They consented, though I think it was the spouse, I forget. They said, well, heart transplantation is experimental, and take the risks, and they did. But one thing that was never disclosed is that the heart was coming from an animal and not a human. So this did not work. James Hardy, the surgeon there, whose pictures his reputation really suffered, and I think rightly so. And then 1984, there was a baboon heart that was transplanted into baby Faye, neonate, and it lasted about 20 days and it didn't work. All right, so the history here is a failure, right? The rejection problem is just been kind of deemed to be insurmountable, right? So you have this allure and this problem, right? And so whenever you talk about xenotransplantation, you have to quote Norman Shumway and say that, yeah, xenotransplantation is the future of transplantation and always will be, right? Because of this problem, this immunological barrier. The other thing too is that people get real squeamish about using organs from primates, right? And there's a kind of recognition that whatever their moral status is, it's just a little too close to human beings, and that has just really fallen out of favor. But, right, in recent history, right, with genetic engineering, we've known for a long time that there's the possibility of genetically engineering a porcine model to supply organs. But the problem is that genetic engineering has been super inefficient until the advent of CRISPR-Cas9, which brought a lot of change. And then we started seeing these articles appear in places like the New England Journal of Medicine, the American Journal of Transplantation, and then Nature, which were reporting the use of porcine xenografts being put into brain-dead patients, right, on an experimental model. So this would be using the brain-dead donor to do a scientific experiment. I think the first one here on the New England Journal of Medicine, they found that it could put out adequate urine for about 70 hours, and then they took it out, and there was no signs of hyperacute rejection. All this stuff has raised questions about research on brain-dead human subjects. I think there's a paper about that in our conference that I'm looking forward to. What does this mean? Like, what kind of oversight regulations do you have? And if the person's dead, what sort of rights do they have? Okay, all these types of things. And how does the consent process work? Right? And there's also questions about whether or not the science is any good too about this, all right? We can talk about that. All right, so this then gets us into experiments with patients, right? And I want to highlight the patients. I don't care about the surgeons. Whenever you, again, search the media, you always have these pictures where the doctors are posing with I mean, it's just like, forget that, right? Forget those guys. The patients here are the people I want to valorize in this talk. And so the first one that I want to talk about is David Bennett Sr. He received the first pig heart xenograft under a compassionate use program. He was excluded from allotransplantation for non-compliance reasons and other comorbidities, and he survived 60 days. There was a second one that was done in 2023 with Lawrence Fawcett here. The outcome there was worse. He only survived 40 days, and the organ showed signs of rejection. Kidneys has actually shown more promise in recent years. So Richard Slayman, our guy here, he received an edited organ, and he was able to benefit from that. But he had, again, lots of comorbidities. He couldn't be on dialysis anymore. He ended up dying. The report from the hospital says there was no indication that the graft caused death. So we just kind of have to take the word for it, I suppose. But Tavana Looney is a much more interesting case at NYU. She is a dialysis patient who ended up taking an experimental xenograft and lived with it for 130 days without dialysis. She reported it improved her quality of life, made her feel like a teenager again. It did eventually fail, and so they had to take it out, and she's back on dialysis. But she would love to be a part of it again, and she's been interviewed. And so there's some other people too that I don't list here. I think Dan and Chris probably could tell you more about them. But this is where things are going, all right? At least in terms of the history, all right? Now, finally, we get to the kind of the big research question that I started with. What should we expect from xenotransplantation? And one of the things I want to say here is the first thing is that Xeno will not close the gap between demand and supply. All right, this is one of these things that is just always thrown out there in the beginning of articles, is that xenotransplantation has the potential to close the gap. And I don't think that's true. All right, and I'll tell you why. All right, if you look at the way the waitlist additions work, they continue to grow in a way that corresponds with our capacity to supply organs. All right. So what this means is that organ donation, at least its economic principles or properties, is that it is supply sensitive. So if you build it, people will come. Okay, people will come. And so there's a kind of recursive logic here, right? Is when the supply of organs goes up, right? The idea of medical need then can change. All right. So for those who were borderline, right? Let's say, oh, look at this right here in 2000, that was the waitlist additions. Hey, here in like 2022, we can meet all that. All right. Well, the thing is that when you have the organs, right, you can then admit more of those borderline patients who were previously excluded, right, and give them a chance. All right. So need is determined by supply. All right. And you can start this logic of it, like, well, who's on the borderline? Who's being excluded? And if you have more organs to use and work with, well, give them a try, right? We'll see what happens. Okay, so you could get to a place one day where we start transplanting for prevention. So you might think of like the pancreatic cancer patient. You could do some screening, and there might be some biomarkers that are telling you that, hey, pancreatic cancer is in your future. You could get that organ out and put the xenograft in and totally avoid all that. All right. So thinking about like, okay, what is the reasonable goal here with this? It's not to close the gap. That is not something that I think is achievable. And if it is, it's really kind of hard to imagine what that might look like. All right. But a better goal that's more realistic and more in keeping with the norms of medicine that we have is just to try to reduce the mortality and morbidity for current candidates. Okay. That should be the more reasonable goal. All right. So let's just think a little bit about just the fantasy of xenotransplantation that gets propounded in the literature, right? So this idea that xenotransplantation could just be totally solve all of our problems, our moral problems with like living donation and deceased organ donation and allotransplantation, right? It's human to human variety. Let's just suppose, right, that xenotransplantation can meet every demand, right? and totally replace allotransplantation. But here's the problem with that. There's three conditions that have to come out basically true for this, right? Is that we can just use animals, right? We can just use them for this. There's no ethical problems with that. There's a no same species preference condition here. No, you can't get an organ from a human. That's not allowed. We're not going to subject people to harm, donors. So that's just not what we're going to do. You have to get it from a pig. All right. And then the easy distribution condition. We can just get these organs to whoever needs them. Right. These are three big assumptions that the scenario of total replacement depends on, and they all just face enduring objections. Right. So the real perennial objection is from animal welfare. If you ever go to like a conference like the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, and there's a talk on xenotransplantation, you can count on somebody in the audience who's going to stand up and give a sermon about animal welfare and won't allow anybody else to ask questions, right? This is just what happens, right? Because people have strong feelings about the moral status of animals, and especially these pigs. They're sentient, right? They're social, they're very intelligent, right? And the assumption is that you can use an animal like that just for organ repository, right? So you have to be committed to some kind of view where pigs either just lack moral status altogether, you can just do whatever you want to them, or they're just well below humans, right? But some facts are that transgenic pigs are raised in a sterile environment without any contact with other pigs, right? They're in total isolation. And they say they're treated humanely, but that humane treatment is only really for the sake of organ health only, right? Whatever interests the pig might have are just totally secondary to that, right? So this question, is it okay to shift the burdens of donation to animals, is a live one. And so I commend this paper by Jasmine Gunkel and Frank Miller about this. They get into this in a deep way that I think is at least important. Now you might think, well, okay, that's just animal rights stuff. What do Christians think about this? Christians tend to hold to a graded view of moral status. And I think this is something that's widely shared. It's consistent with what we think about in medical practice, right? Animals deserve some respect and care, but can be used for human purposes. And that's just a widely held belief. But there is a voice in Christian thought, in recent Christian thought, who's actually got a lot of influence, and that is C.S. Lewis in his famous little essay here, Vivisection. He just takes issue with animal experimentation at all levels, right? And he really kind of goes after this argument that allows for this graded view of moral status. The argument goes like this. It's like, well, look, humans have moral status because they have rational capacities and they're able to understand, the glory of God and perceive his nature and so on and so forth, right? The animals don't have that. And so this is why they can use animals for their own purposes, right? And he parodies this. He's like, well, look, humans deserve some respect and care too, but could be used for angelic purposes who have greater capacity for enjoying and experiencing God and for rationality. You might be able to point to the book of Job, where you have the angelic hosts, right, talking with God, and they kind of basically run an experiment on Job, right? And this seems rather terrible to many readers. And Lewis then ends his essay by saying, in justifying cruelty to animals, we put ourselves also on the animal level. We choose the jungle and must abide by our choice. And Lewis is consistent with this throughout his writings. If you read that Hideous Strength, which is a broadside against biomedical research, right? That's one of the main themes. He's very, very critical of biomedical researchers. In the end, right, the animals have their revenge upon the biomedical researchers. So Lewis's views of the eschaton and his theology of animals aren't real consistent with this graded view of moral status. I don't know what he would say about xenotransplantation today, but I suspect it would be rather negative. All right, I don't want to talk too much about the no same species preference condition. All right, I think it's just clearly false. Total replacement could never work because there's always going to be those who reasonably retain a same species preference in their medical decision making. There's still going to be a preference to donate one's organs that's hard to reject as morally objectionable. Total replacement would make like the first type of transplantation between identical twins to be just totally immoral, which is absurd, right? So that is it's just not going to work. All right. So allotransplantation is still going to be something that people want and are going to consider. The easy distribution condition, right? If you suppose that xenotransplantation is safe and effective, that doesn't mean it's going to be affordable and accessible, right? This Repo Men movie kind of gets into this where people are taking mechanical organs, I think, out of people because people can't pay for them, right? It's got Jude Law in it and Forrest Whitaker and lots of violence. So, but anyway, the idea here is like, again, right? This is a business interest, right? People are investing billions of dollars into creating these pigs. They're going to want a return on their investment. All right, so it's kind of pigs for profit here. There's pay to play, right? You might exclude the needy. You can't just like change it. It's not like changing a tire, like putting a kidney or a heart in somebody. This is going to have to go through a surgery center, and there's only so many of those and so many people that can do that. So there's going to be a bottleneck anyway. All right, and then if allotransplantation remains superior for immunological reasons, you might think this just compounds health inequities. There'll be pig organs for the poor and human organs for the rich, or who knows what. All right. Okay, so that's total replacement. That's something I point these things out just to talk about. Like, look, it's a fantasy, and that will never happen. All right, I'm very, very pessimistic about that. All right. So what about a theology of xenotransplantation? I kind of tend to think this is unclear and needs development. The Vatican has a long teaching about this that's pretty interesting. And there's questions about respect for God's design in crossing species boundaries. But then, everybody seems to accept things like heart valves that come from pigs, right? Islet cells and pancreas to help diabetic patients. These seem to be fine. There's people who are worried about like a chimera. Are we creating a chimera, human porcine chimera? And is that an abomination, or is that warrant feelings of disgust and so on? I think the question I always like to kind of pose here is like, well, if you put a pig kidney in somebody, does that change their status as a rational animal? That's how I think like Christian theology, at least in one way, has defined what it means to be a human being. And if it doesn't change that nature, then there doesn't seem to be much to worry about here, but other people might feel differently. Another question too is will xenotransplantation help us fulfill our mission as Christians? Right? That's a question that's rarely, rarely asked in this space. All right, so that's all the abstract stuff, kind of far out there, sci-fi stuff. Let's just talk about now, like what can really happen in the next few years, right? Let's talk about clinical trials, which have started, with, at least for the kidneys. And let's talk about some of the ethical issues. Now, there's tons of these, right? Is there a positive risk-benefit ratio? All right, public health, how does that affect that? Distributive justice, post-trial responsibilities. I'm only going to focus on two, right? Selection criteria for people that we might select in a trial. And then we're going to talk about informed consent and the right to withdraw. All right, so selection criteria, historically at least, has been relegated to those who I'm going to call the worst off, right? So institutions like the FDA and other regulators, they limit xenotransplantation experience to those with serious or life-threatening diseases for whom adequately safe and effective alternative therapies are just not available, right? So there's a no alternatives condition here, right? So these are going to be patients who are in advanced organ failure, right? Their options have run out. They're not a candidate for getting an allotransplant or something like an LVAD. They might not be able to use dialysis anymore, right? They're in dire straits, okay? Now, the one question I'm going to raise here is this fair, right? Is this fair, right? That's one question I want to ask, and that's going to be about distributing the burdens of research on a patient population. Why pick these people, right? That's one question. And then I'm going to also ask the question about, is this going to be scientifically valid, right? This is when we do experiments for knowledge's sake, right? We hope that we can help people, but we do this for knowledge's sake, all right? Well, the type of people who end up in the worst off category usually are excluded for medical problems already. That's already one thing we have to think about. But there's other people who get excluded too. People who have been deemed non-adherent, right, to a treatment program, or they lack psychosocial support. And there's lots of room for bias in how those two things get attached to people. right? And some of my work as an ethicist at the hospital is really digging down deep into those things. It's like, well, why did you miss your appointments? It's like, well, I was in the ICU. It's like, oh, all right. So you got to get this information right to the right people in the medical review board so that they can make a good decision, and they don't always have it, all right? So you might think that there could be some compounding of injustices here. Also, too, if you have just a really sick patient and you put a xenograft in them, and then they die of like a comorbidity or complication that's unrelated to the graft, what kind of scientific evidence are you getting out of this people, right? This was actually one of the big problems with the heart transplants, okay? And then you're subjecting these people to infectious disease risk. So the benefits here for them are real low and the burdens are real high. So one thing you might be able to do, right, to broaden and make things a little bit fairer, right, is get different people that are maybe on the list, the disadvantaged, okay? And so you're broadening things here, right? And you want to get people maybe that are on the wait list who have a long wait or increased risk of mortality. They have a low chance of an offer. You know, they get frequent mismatches in HLA, and they have recurrent diseases. And so you might think you could go to them and ask them, all right? And so that might then expand the number of people that you could talk to. These people have been listed, right? They have been deemed to have the requisite psychosocial support and are predicted to be adherent. So you might have somebody here who could be a better candidate to, first of all, maybe benefit, and then also provide some better validity for the study. Okay, so you could study the things about potential benefits. You might be able to bridge somebody to an allotransplantation. All right, and you might be able to lower the infectious disease risk through the study. Okay, but then you have this question, well, how does this affect their listing? Do they get taken off the list? All right, do they get relisted with priority when the graft fails? Right, is there a kind of reciprocity? Right, that's a big question. All right, one thing too, then you could really expand, right? And the research burden, not just from the very worst off or the sick, but you could also bring out your healthy, right? So you could broaden this to healthy patients. All right, now why would you ever do that? Well, the idea here is to take somebody who's already donating a kidney to somebody else, say maybe their family member or something like that, and you could ask them, would you be willing? You're already undertaking a lot of risk for donation. Would you be willing to take a xenograft? Now, there's probably a lot of people who might turn this down, but you might find one or two people who are super generous and want to help the science advance. All right, so what would this do for scientific validity? Well, it kind of depends. All right, you might be able to get some good data about antibody rejection, but probably not overall function because you have a living person with a human kidney in there already working. And so how do you assess function and so on and so forth? Of course, the big objection to this that I think every IRB is going to balk at is that it seems like you're just compounding the level of risk and to harm to a person who's already healthy. That you might make it impossible for them to receive any organ by sensitizing to an animal one, right? And then, of course, you open them up to zoonotic infection, right? So those are questions about fairness and inclusion. And we already have big problems with that in biomedical research, right? Most of our research studies are limited to, men, women and pregnant women and children often get left out. So you already have those problems in the background here. And so then you have these other ones too about health status, right? And so it's just very difficult about how we can make this fair and also do good science, right? So then let's talk about informed consent, right? It's well known that the elements of this is you need adequate disclosure about the risks and benefits and the alternatives. The patient has to have some level of understanding of these things. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be at least adequate, right? And they need to express a voluntary choice in favor of the experiment. So informed consent and all these things was extremely questionable, especially in the first xenotransplantation, where they didn't even disclose that the heart could come from a chimpanzee. It was a little bit better in 1984 with baby Faye, but even then, the benefit ratio was probably distorted, saying, well, she could benefit long term. It's like, well, she lasted 20 days, all right? So it didn't work, right? Xenotransplantation is highly experimental, right? And here's the thing, though, and this happens in transplant medicine. This is just the way it is. patients are in it for therapy, right? They're usually not in it to advance science. They want to benefit from this. And so there's this risk of therapeutic misconception. And xenotransplantation has been compared to like phase one oncology trials, where you're just dosing for toxicity and you have cancer patients who are at the end of the rope, right? There's no options left for them. The chemo has failed and they enroll in one of these things hoping for benefit, which is just super unlikely, right? There's that same sort of worry with xenotransplantation. There's a worry about this kind of desperation for therapy, leading to an undue inducement. And if you are wondering what that means, it's kind of like an offer that's too good to refuse. It calls into questions the patient's voluntariness. It might be a problem for no alternative patients, right? David Bennett Sr. sort of had it in his mind. It was either die or do this transplant. That's not it's something we might want to at least ask questions about, like how was the offer framed to participate to him? I think there's ways of framing it that do protect voluntariness, right? But you got to be careful. One of the things is that you don't want to like play up the potential benefit, right? And make that seem excessive, okay? And then that might produce some poor judgment, all right? And the question that we really need to ask is, can the person reasonably say no to what you're offering, all right? And speaking of saying no, right, one of the problems with some of the, at least ethics about uh, developing a clinical trial has been about um, the inability to withdraw from it. Okay, because xenotransplantation, because you're taking an animal organ and you're putting it in a human, that raises the risk of a zoonotic infection and having viruses and other germs transfer into the human being. And we know, right, from COVID-19 or the AIDS crisis, that these viruses can then come from animal resources. Maybe they're, developed in gain of function or whatever, but they come from animals, right? And then they get into humans and they cause terrible suffering, right? So this is something that is worried researchers for a long time. They recommend things like long-term biosurveillance, maybe lifelong, right? Infectious disease monitoring. So this is going to be blood labs at least once a month, probably more. And then you have to also monitor people's close contacts, right, for infectious disease. And even if you get an organ taken out of you, say they take the pig kidney out of you, you still have right? Elements in your blood from that still deem you as an infectious disease risk. And so the FDA, Nuffield, HWO, AMA, they have all recommended lifelong or long-term biosurveillance. But how do you make people do that? Right? Since Nuremberg and Belmont and Declaration of Helsinki, they all say you can withdraw at any time. In fact, that's in part and parcel to what it means to give informed consent. You can give informed refusal too, right? And so some people think, well, we can use informed consent to have people waive their right to withdraw. And they sort of draw upon this idea of a Ulysses contract, right? Where you bind yourself through the consent process to lifelong biosurveillance. Problem with that is that Ulysses contracts really only apply when their capacity is compromised. All right, so that's, here's Ulysses, right? He's tied to the mast. His men have tied him there. They got wax in their ears. The sirens are singing, and the Ulysses is like, untie me. I want to find out more about the siren. And they're like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. Okay, that is not what's happening here. All right. What the ask is that you're asking somebody to waive, right, their right to bodily autonomy, right? And you're asking them to use their own autonomy to do that, right? So you're appealing to this good, right, to really undermine it and divest yourself of it, which doesn't make any sense. It's like, hey, I'm going to use informed consent to sell myself into slavery. There's an incoherence to that because it really fails to recognize the authority retaining power and character of consent. Right. So I was recently hospitalized. I had this nurse that was trying to get blood out of me. And I finally just said, no more of this. Right. And they had to stop with the tourniquet and the poking. Right. Give me a break. Right. I had consented to blood draws. All right. I certainly did. But then I withheld it because I still retain that authority. Right. And that doesn't change for xeno research subjects either. Okay. Here's the thing, too. If there is like a public health risk, well, the public health authority can come in and just limit liberty rights, right, on a case-by-case basis. And here's the other thing, too, is if the risk is really high of spreading infectious disease, this clinical trial should probably not get off the ground or probably should cease. All right. So this idea of making people waive their right to their bodily autonomy, I think, just has to be rejected. All right, so there's way more ethical questions here to ask. All right, I'm not going to get into those. I want to save some time here for Q&A. I'm getting close to time. I just focused on those two. So what should we expect? Well, I think we're going to see further progress in research and clinical outcomes, right? I think the best probably we can hope for is that xenotransplantation will become a bridge first to allotransplantation before it becomes a destination. I think we'll see this with kidney patients first before we see progress with heart failure and liver failure patients. There's going to be more heated debates, especially over the pediatric xenotransplantation experiments. I didn't even get into that, right? And that is way more difficult to decide and figure out, all right? And then there's still going to be continued resistance to using animals for xenotransplantation, and overcoming that objection will be an ongoing project. So listen, I am like super excited to talk to you and answer questions, talk about anything, brain death, organ donation, all the different schemes that people have out there for maximizing organ donation, double effect donation, xenotransplantation, the whole 9 yards. This stuff is super exciting to me. So I'm going to stop the share here and invite questions and comments and criticisms and all the things that I know that I'm going to get from all y'all.
Dr. Omelianchuk,